y las demás instituciones. La Cátedra de Broa fue creada en 2015 y tiene el objetivo de generar una plataforma académica que propicie, a través de coloquios, conferencias, jornadas y seminarios, el intercambio de experiencias, de teorías y prácticas entre artistas, críticos e investigadores con respecto a la imagen. Esa, digamos que es la línea. Pero actualmente, ante el panorama de situaciones contingentes relativas a nuevas condiciones de producción crítica, la emergencia política en múltiples dimensiones y una comprensión expandida de la imagen desde la práctica artística y la academia, Campus Expandido está trabajando en la renovación o más bien en la ampliación de la misión de la Cátedra de Broa hacia un estudio de la visualidad en términos que exceden el medio fotográfico y, por tanto, que exploren modalidades contemporáneas de formas de repensar el mundo desde espacios críticos de la imagen, con un énfasis en los problemas urgentes del presente. Entonces, este es el marco general de la conferencia de Gregori, hablando desde el MUAC. Ahora justamente le voy a ceder la palabra a Alberto López Cuenca para que él nos hable como de una manera más sustantiva también del proyecto de manera más global. Y bueno, eso, agradecerles nuevamente y pues ya, dar inicio a Bajo el Muro. Muchas gracias.
Pues muchísimas gracias personalmente a Mónica, a mi Eva, al MUAC y a todo el equipo del MUAC, por supuesto, a Julio García Murillo también, desde el MUAC, y al resto de instituciones que han hecho posible, están haciendo posible un proyecto como Abajo el Muro, ¿no? Desde el ITESO en Guadalajara, como mencionaba Mónica, con el trabajo de Mario Rosales, que ha sido muy importante en apoyar este proyecto, el Museo Amparo igualmente, especialmente con la figura de Ramiro Martínez, ¿sí? Apoyando desde esa institución el que podamos organizar esta red de colaboración, y el espacio de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UAP. ¿Por qué esta insistencia en ese carácter interinstitucional de Abajo el Muro? Tiene que ver precisamente con que desde un principio pensamos que la propia condición, ¿cómo les diré?, dispersa de un acontecimiento como el que tuvo lugar en 1989, es decir, que tuvo distintas temporalidades, es decir, no aconteció solo exclusivamente en Berlín, sino que hizo estallar, ¿no?, distintos límites en los relatos pues en este caso del marxismo de Estado, ¿verdad?, en muchísimos países, específicamente en Europa del Este, pero no solo. Nos parecía que tenía un estatuto solamente comparable a lo que ocurrió en 1968 o a lo que ocurrió con las revoluciones de 1848, ¿no? en el siglo XIX. Es decir, que tuvo una suerte de efecto en paralelo en muchísimos lugares. Y eso nos parecía que exigía un proceso de descentralización para pensar en estos últimos 30 años qué había ocurrido en la configuración o la desconfiguración de la escena del arte contemporáneo desde México. Por eso nuestra insistencia en abrir distintos espacios de reflexión y poder desplazar a los invitados entre al menos estas tres instituciones, ¿no?, que implicaran también salir de Ciudad de México, es decir, estar tanto en Guadalajara, en Puebla y acá. Pero ¿por qué pensar 1989? Por una parte, nos parecía, y no solo obviamente por la premura, ¿verdad?, de las conmemoraciones, ¿no? Nos hemos adelantado un poco porque en realidad suponemos que el boom de las referencias mediáticas y el trending topic de la caída del muro de Berlín será en noviembre, ¿no? Pero a nosotros nos parecía importante expandir el lapso de reflexión, no solo geográficamente, sino también temporalmente, e intentar buscar puntos de enclave. De alguna manera ha habido un proceso de deshistorización, un proceso en el que la historia ha devenido una suerte de presente continuo, ¿sí? No hay como puntos de anclaje que permitan estrategias de referencia. Parece que vivimos en un presente continuo en el que las formas que han cobrado las instituciones en la actualidad hubieran estado siempre ahí de antemano, ¿sí? Es obvio que eso no es así, pero también es cierto que muchos de los relatos que estaban intentando dar cuenta de eso han desarticulado de alguna manera su anclaje con esos otros momentos históricos. Entonces, para nosotros 1989 significaba la oportunidad de volver a abrir un horizonte de reflexión respecto a cómo se reconfiguró la escena de las artes plásticas, ¿sí?, sobre todo vinculadas con las formas que toma el arte contemporáneo desde entonces. Hay todo un conjunto de temas, no me voy a detener en eso ahí, tienen aquí el programa genérico de Abajo el Muro, con los temas que aborda, pero nos interesó reflexionar al menos sobre un bloque de cuestiones. Una primera tenía que ver con qué significó la caída del muro a partir de 1989 y el colapso de lo que podíamos llamar comunismo de Estado, ¿sí? Pues desde Polonia a la Unión Soviética, pasando por Hungría, por Rumanía o por Albania, los únicos 3 estados que resistieron a ese colapso, ¿no? Los más notorios de ellos, pues son Cuba, Corea del Norte y Vietnam originalmente, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué ocurrió con todas esas desconfiguraciones? Se producen y que de alguna manera hacen imaginable lo que el historiador Peter Linebaugh llama pensar y activar los comunismos desde abajo, es decir, formas de experimentación social, formas de estrategias de encontrarse, de volver a tejer estrategias de encuentro y de organización social sin la participación ni del Estado, ni del Politburó, ni del partido. ¿Sí? Entonces esto es muy interesante porque lo que produce eso, si se fijan ustedes, si prestamos atención tanto a los discursos que se producen en el mundo del arte como en los discursos curatoriales, todo este giro hacia lo que se ha llamado arte participativo, arte colaborativo, estética relacional, que empieza a cobrar esa dimensión a principios de la década, a final de la década de los 90, ¿no? En esta suerte de coyuntura, de descomposición, de esa articulación de ese discurso de Estado, ¿no? Ese comunismo estatal, vamos a decirlo con Linebaugh, ¿no? Entonces, a nosotros esto nos parecía que era muy importante, es decir, cómo este colapso ha hecho imaginable cuando no estableció como una urgencia, incluso, vamos a decir, ética, de parte de las prácticas artísticas, de hacerse cargo de algo que el Estado había dejado de hacerse cargo, que tenía que ver con la construcción de un proyecto colectivo de emancipación, ¿no? Claro, desde unas posiciones que podríamos llamar quizá micropolíticas, ¿no? En realidad no eran grandes proyectos de emancipación, sino pequeñas estrategias de intervención. Eso era una de las cosas que nos parecía un rasgo definitorio que estaba claramente vinculado con ese proceso abierto con el 89. Un segundo aspecto tendría que ver con la lógica de la globalización que subsumía y que subsume eso que se ha dado en denominar arte latinoamericano, ¿no? Que paradójicamente ocupa un lugar en el mercado y en el circuito global de bienales, ¿no? De exposiciones a partir de 1989, pero lo hace en la medida en que deja de ser reconocible explícitamente como un arte local. Quiero decir, yo creo que no les cuesta a ustedes venir a la mente, ¿verdad?, las prácticas artísticas significativas del neoconceptual mexicano, ¿no?, en los 90, que podían haber sido hechas prácticamente en cualquier otro lugar del globo, ¿no? Entonces nos interesaba mucho el tema también entre la expansión de la globalización y las estrategias, vamos a decir así, de constitución o no, eso que podíamos llamar o que hemos llamado, ¿no?, las venas abiertas de América Latina, ¿no?, en un guiño a Galeano, obviamente. Es decir, ¿en qué manera hubo formas de resistencia y organización o fue la apertura, digamos, para la explotación global de esos recursos artísticos en la década de los 90? O producir todo un conjunto de formas de resistencia, que es interesante, en torno a 1994 y después la figura, el imaginario mediático que se produce con el EZLN va a ser fundamental para articular, ¿no?, tanto en términos de formas de representación, pero también de formas de organización directa, otras maneras de hacer, ¿no?, en esa coyuntura. Otro de los temas que proponemos abordar tiene que ver con lo que llamamos el papel de la ruina. O sea, la ruina del Estado socialdemócrata, ¿no?, del Estado que se hace cargo de ese proyecto, digamos, social de izquierdas y que paulatinamente va privatizando, vendiendo, cediendo, ¿no?, la educación, las telecomunicaciones, ¿no?, la seguridad, si es que alguna vez hubo tal cosa por parte del Estado, ¿verdad? Y que las prácticas artísticas incursionan y se hacen cargo y reflexionan y forman estrategias de colaboración desde esas propias coyunturas, ¿no? Y que tenía que ver, por tanto, con esa idea de la ruina. Finalmente, unos dos temas y con eso acabo, que para nosotros están directamente vinculados con este corte que se puede hacer histórico y conceptual con el 89, ¿sí?, que tendría que ver con lo que hemos denominado el extractivismo social. Es decir, en qué medida ese giro hacia las estrategias de colaboración no estarían encubriendo en realidad más que estrategias de autogestión y empoderamiento, una suerte de, vamos a decirlo así en términos marxistas, de falsa conciencia, es decir, de la construcción de eso que Mauricio Lazarato ha llamado el empresario de sí mismo, ¿no? El sujeto como empresario de sí mismo y el artista, por tanto, como emprendedor. ¿En qué medida lo que estaba ocurriendo ahí, en esas lógicas, ¿no?, autogestivas, en ese boom de la autogestión, no estaba quizás encubriendo pues, la constitución de un nuevo sujeto, de un sujeto neoliberal, ¿no?, inscrito precisamente en esas nuevas condiciones fijadas por la práctica artística después del 89? Y finalmente nos interesa pensar en una coyuntura muy reciente cómo en realidad ese colapso en ese discurso no solo del comunismo de Estado, sino de la propia socialdemocracia, ha dado pie al surgimiento de unas formas populistas conservadoras, ¿no? Creo que no hace falta enumerarlas, que ha habido todo un descrédito de la política liberal, ¿no?, en términos de la lógica de representación parlamentaria y una suerte de puesta en marcha de figuras, ¿no?, desde Trump al Brexit, ¿no?, pasando por todo un conjunto, no solo de la derecha, sino también de la izquierda. Pensemos en la situación, ¿no?, que se da con Hugo Chávez en Venezuela a principios de los 2000, de figuras mesiánicas que operan con una lógica populista que se saltan la figura del partido o de la representatividad, sino que operan como figuras de cierre. Ahí nos gustaría pensar, bueno, ¿qué puede el arte en esa coyuntura? ¿Sí? En fin, les cuento todo esto porque creo que quizás habría que, y con eso cierro, enfatizar que lo que con Abajo el Muro buscamos es diseminar los espacios de discusión para intentar pensarnos en relación con esta suerte de cisma, de quiebre que significó el 1989 en términos de representarnos y de representar las prácticas artísticas y sus estrategias de emancipación social. ¿Sí? Y nos ha interesado especialmente armar eso desde México, o sea, pensar en un lugar que aparentemente es periférico a ese acontecimiento, ¿no?, cómo imaginamos eso desde ese emplazamiento. Y bueno, y para hacer eso, pues tenemos todo un conjunto de invitados, los conmino a que entren pues, a la página para ver el programa detallado, porque esto que les mostramos aquí es solo las conferencias inaugurales y los temas principales, pero hay seminarios, mesas redondas con una cantidad pues notoria de invitados en todas las sedes. Entonces les invitaría a que revisen, pues está en redes sociales como Abajo el Muro, ¿sí?, y en el MAC lo pueden encontrar también el programa detallado para su consulta. Yo creo que ya, de nuevo, insistir en el agradecimiento a todas las instituciones implicadas para haber sacado en marcha Abajo el Muro y a todos nuestros invitados y especialmente hoy a Gregory Cholet que nos acompaña en esta charla inaugural. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alberto, por darnos este marco general. Ahora, bueno, ya va a dar inicio la conferencia, pero antes Julio García Murillo, curador académico de Campus Expandido, va a presentarla.
Buenos días. Mis palabras van a ser breves y van a ser leídas también. Realmente muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Gregory. Rápidamente voy a leer un poco la semblanza de Gregory. Antes de empezar a leerla, la conferencia durará alrededor de 45 minutos y después de eso ya podremos levantar algunas preguntas y bueno, empezar una ronda de discusión. Gregory Cholet es artista, escritor y activista, radicado en la ciudad de Nueva York. Es fundador del colectivo Political Art Documentation Distribution, donde trabajó con publicaciones sobre activismo artístico durante la década de los años 80. Es miembro de Gulf Labor Coalition, colectivo de artistas que buscó denunciar la precariedad laboral que vivieron los trabajadores migrantes en la construcción de los museos en Abu Dhabi. Bajo la misma línea de investigación, ha desarrollado proyectos como Precarious Workers Pageant, performance que fue premiado en la Bienal de Venecia en agosto del 2015. Su más reciente proyecto, es la documentación colaborativa que lleva a cabo en la Zeppelin University, titulado Imaginary Archive, Archivo Imaginario, Zeppelin University. Es autor de los libros Is the Political Economy Stupid? Y Dark Matter, Art and Politics in the Age of the Enterprise Culture. Así como también ha escrito docenas de ensayos y ha colaborado y publicado en algunos medios y revistas como eFlux, Critical Inquiry, Texte zur Kunst, October, CAA, entre otras. Del mismo modo, ha codirigido el programa de investigación social, Choreography Research Group, en el Centro de Humanidades de la Universidad de Nueva York, la City University of New York. Es egresado del Whitney Dependent Studio Program in Critical Theory, programa integrado a la Escuela de Diseño de la Universidad de Harvard, y actualmente trabaja como profesor de prácticas artísticas en CUNY, la City University of New York, donde ayudó también a establecer el área de Social Practice. Pues, Greg, muchas gracias. La conferencia va a ser en inglés y en la ronda de las preguntas podemos empezar a traducir también.
Thank you, Julio. And I apologize. I will be speaking in English. If I speak too fast or something, just say, hey, what did you mean by that? Thank you, Monica and Alberto, for the great introduction, and MUAC for hosting this. It's really great to be here. And all of you for coming out. I had actually prepared like a whole paper, and then I sort of realized that's really not the right context for it. So I might read a little bit of this, and then you can read it when it gets published. And I'm going to talk a little bit, and we can have a conversation about things. I think this question around that Alberto raises around this kind of shift 1989 is really interesting. Just my own background, I came to New York City from Philadelphia area in 1977, and I grew up in a kind of a working class family, really. Nobody else went to college in my family except for me. So I moved there, and I sort of had a whole new education about reality. I moved in with a woman. She was 81 years old. She rented a room to me, and she had been a member of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party before that, and had been born in Russia. And I had this whole new education about the history of the United States, the labor unions, and so on and so forth. But I also entered a city that had collapsed from the social welfare liberal state, which had sort of failed, of course, for other reasons, than what are usually attributed to it. And parts of the city were just crumbling. There were buildings that had fallen down, and so on and so forth. And people were trying to make gardens out of the rubble. It was incredible. When I tell this to my students now, and any of you who've been to New York, they look at me like I'm mad, and I say, "This is what New York looked like," and they can't believe that it was just this kind of ruin in many places. So this was the city I saw, and then of course in '89 there is a big shift. There's this important shift, I think that Alberto has correctly pointed to. There are other things we could talk about. '87, when the stock market crashed seriously, and the art world crashed about 2 years after that. It's very interesting because it took a little time, and then the market went like this, right? What's interesting is that after the crash in 2008, the art market dipped a little and then went up. It was one of the only markets that you could actually put money in and continue to get a return on investment. Something very fundamentally interesting happened between that period of the late 80s and the 2008, the period we're in now. I think that's important. So anyway, I think Alberto's point about the left, let's say, or even perhaps the communist horizon as something that one could look forward to or think about, clearly underwent an important change at that point when the Soviet Union, for all of its problems, collapses. And as he says, it left artists in a funny position. On the one hand, and I'll just read a little bit of this. On the one hand, artists inherited this emancipatory discourse of the early avant-garde that once linked art with a communist horizon in which, as Marx imagined it, we would all be able to fish in the morning and do critical theory in the evening without ever becoming either a fisherman or a critic or an artist for that matter, or a curator. On the other hand, with the demise of the Soviet Union and its unsuccessful attempt at realizing a post-capitalist society, politically committed artists and intellectuals have been freed to wander the capitalist desert without a roadmap or compass, although with plenty of theories. And speaking now of one of the wanderers, I feel like we actually have sort of we sort of got an inheritance that had no dowry or endowment to it, right? The response to this ambivalent condition has often been more ambivalence, with successive attempts at reattaching radical, or dare we say avant-garde art, to a politically liberatory project, one that too often involves a visually challenging formalism that is nevertheless shorn of any obligation to political transformation. It's as if, imagine we could sever Bertolt Brecht's alienation effect that sought to undermine the seemingly naturalistic tropes of bourgeois realism from the poet and playwright's lifelong commitment to working class and oppressed people. Right? And yet that is precisely what so much contemporary art has settled for in its effort to be subversive towards capitalism, generating provocative commodities that mimic, or perhaps, as Fred Jameson suggests, offer a symbolic solution to the seemingly irresolvable, ideologically driven contradictions of our day-to-day lives. Perhaps most troubling is that too often, even those self-defined radical or Marxist art historians seem satisfied with focusing on the official art stars sanctified by the culture industry. They seldom look past this firmament into the darkness beyond. That darkness beyond is really what interests me and has interested me for a very long time, for various reasons. So if I go back to the 70s, where I arrive in New York and I come out of art school, I got involved with various collectives, one of them called Political Art Documentation Distribution, or PADD. And we started an archive about political art, when political art, believe it or not, was considered completely sort of persona non grata. It's hard to believe now, because everything seems political. In fact, we had this conversation in my class the other day. Someone brought up a painter, maybe you don't know him, Sam Gilliam. He was an abstract painter from the really kind of made his career in the 1970s. He also happened to be African American. Someone wrote a piece about him recently, and all they could talk about was the fact that he was African American, and the canvas, the way he hung it, maybe had something to do with lynching. And it was obvious that they could not talk about his work as abstract art anymore. It's not possible to do that. That was not the case in the 70s. You could not talk about political art. It was very difficult to do because everybody imagined socialist realism or social realism, which was completely debunked, of course, by Clement Greenberg and others. So we tried to create an archive and tried to create newsletters and discussions around this kind of work. And we succeeded, so that by the end of the 80s, and not just we, there was a movement obviously bigger than us. By the end of the 80s, there was a little bit more opening for art and politics in the New York City area. The 1992 Whitney Biennale was claimed to be a political biennale. Those of us who had been sort of in the trenches doing this work went to the Biennale and went, what are you talking about? This is like art as usual with a little veneer of politics, precisely what I was just talking about a minute ago. But okay, it had at least opened up that discussion. What interested me was all of that work that didn't get historicized, theorized, discussed. The collectives in particular, because many people worked collectively, as many people worked collectively here in Mexico and other places. They just seemed to fall out of the mainstream. It just fell into the dark matter, as I call it, the sort of spaces in between. And so I tried to think about how would one talk about that. Let's talk about this as a kind of other sphere, right? Or an other kind of genealogy. But it's really not a genealogy in that sense. It's really more of a kind of surplus archive, one that is brimming with experiments and repetitions, interesting risk-taking and minor victories, as well as compromises, dead ends, and outright failures. Envision this sort of pockmarked vault as a crypt or an enclosure that is closeted within or just beneath the edifice known as mainstream art history. Now visualize this crypt, this surplus archive, suddenly splitting open, thanks to the very same forces that Lopez Cuenca has described as the neoliberal juggernaut, the one that takes over after the Soviet experiment, after the communist horizon fails. Or that we might also call this enterprise culture, an apparatus of capture that relentlessly is in search of new sources of value within what Mario Tronti, the Marxist theoretician, called the social factory. That is the effective, immaterial, cognitive arena which digital capitalism has rapidly enclosed, like the pitiful Amontillado in Edgar Allan Poe's well-known Revenge story, which is a story about a wall, of course, as well, right? So what oozes out from this breach, this archival breach? It's a weak yet superabundant ectoplasmic force whose previously sequestered yet paradoxically always present labor served to reproduce the mainstream art world, including its markets and discourses and hierarchies of visibility and invisibility. I call this this agency dark matter. And I really talk about the way it is the dark matter of the art world, and it has three components. So I'm just going to go through this and then give you some more examples. First, it's the 99% of professionally trained creative workers who maintain and reproduce contemporary art. This is a form of dark matter that is obscured within plain sight. Think of the art handlers, the registrars, the fabricators, the studio managers, many who have earned MFAs or other professional degrees and yet never gained market visibility. This is a structural and not a naturalistic relationship, right? It's not that some artists are just so great that they succeed, right? It's that there is a structural reason why most artists do not succeed, and they help to reproduce what the art world is. There's a second category that I talked about. Now I'm going back 10 years when I first started writing about this, and certainly things have changed, which we'll talk about in a minute. Second category is those artists who, for either economic or political reasons, self-marginalize their own practice. And we can think of many examples of that, although, of course, that situation has changed. And third, and the more complicated or difficult area, is the legion of untrained, let's call them creatives, who simply fall outside of the event horizon of contemporary high culture. The amateurs, the Sunday painters, and the so-called prosumers, or what theorist Stephen Wright, has labeled simply users. I would maintain that without this multitude of shadowy producers, the art world as we know it would cease to exist. Remarkably, however, and this is what I wrote after the 2008 collapse, this is sort of that second marker. Remarkably, in the past few decades, this ungainly surplus archive has mobilized in all sorts of ways, sometimes with progressive motives and outcomes, though sadly more and more we see these days especially disturbingly reactionary and resentful intentions. So let me just give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. And let me start with this quote. How do we get the other screen? Yeah. No, the one underneath. Thank you. So I just want to start with this quote, because this was very important to me when I started to think about these ideas and try to historicize them. This notion that there's a kind of fantastic production that goes on within sort of the working class that is suppressed or blocked, right? Is it possible to think about this notion of dark matter as linked to those desires, those hopes, and that as it's unblocked, and it's unblocked for precisely the reasons that we talked about, which is the introduction of neoliberalism in many ways, right? Does that then sort of lead to some sort of, moment of liberation? And I think it's gotten a lot more complicated, the answer. But okay, just to do a quick survey, the people who do the work, right? And I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes. Here we have people who are protesting Sotheby's, who's one of the major sort of, markets in New York for art, right? One of the auction houses. And they were locking out their union workers so that they couldn't actually participate because they wanted to start a union. People who do the fabrication of art. This is this first category, let's say, of dark matter. The artists who sort of decided to withdraw from the art world, or partially withdraw in some cases, to protest what was going on. And I think you probably are familiar with this group from the 1960s. And then you have sort of this weird zone of maybe prosumer, right? What's somehow people producing and consuming there simultaneously. Something that initially, I think, just after, sort of in the late 80s and 90s, particularly in the 90s, people thought this was going to be a liberatory force. You look at people like Lawrence Lessig from Harvard, and he's talking about the way the internet is going to bind these prosumers together and create this kind of fantastic new opportunity for democracy. And of course, we've seen something very different happen. That's not that that wasn't a threat or isn't still possible, but we've seen the internet slowly become encircled and enclosed by capitalism with all kinds of problematics. And yet it's still an interesting force. So again, this kind of ectoplasmic amateurism bubbling out of this underground pit, this crypt, surplus archive, which we would not see, which was not represented, and is still not represented a lot, but is beginning to be talked about and thought about, and scholars are sort of taking more seriously, but certainly not in the past when I first started thinking about these issues. Let me give you a little bit more of an example to underscore this. Right? So in the year 2000, Bulgarian-born artist, professionally trained artist, Daniel Bozhkov, he was teaching a class at Skowhegan School, which is in Maine in the United States, and he decided to get a job as a Walmart greeter at a nearby Walmart. And of course, I think you know what Walmart is, one of these big box stores. He got this job as a greeter, which is someone who you see when you enter the store, and I guess they're a friendly face and they make you feel comfortable, you're at home. But he also convinced the store owner to let him make a frieze, paint a frieze inside one of the spaces inside the building. Not a very overt space, but a place where people would like hang their coats or something like that. And so for months he worked on this frieze, and it was nothing radical or political. It was, he had people from the region. Again, this is all the way northeast in the United States. It's one of the poorest states in the United States, Maine. You had products there, you had landscapes. And he did it in a color scheme, let me just see if I get this right here, which was gray and dark blue, because that was the corporate color scheme of Walmart itself. 4 years later, Walmart changed its color scheme to something else, and they had to get rid of the frieze, which I think he found a way to remove and put in an art gallery or whatever. It's a funny and interesting intervention, but let me talk about a second piece. And I don't have any pictures of this work for personal reasons, really, but let's just say this is the institution, this is a corporation that I'm referring to. So in the 1980s, now this is before Bozhkov, a close relation of mine worked in the shipping and receiving department of a non-unionized Pennsylvania factory. He, along with several of his coworkers, spent their work breaks attaching newspaper clippings, snapshots, spent soda cans, industrial debris, trashed food containers, and similar life fragments to one wall of the plant. After a few years, this accumulated clutter expanded to include the entire wall, and they christened their impromptu collage Swamp Wall. Swamp Wall. The factory's owner was an elderly person, kind of like back in like the 19th century mode. He was like, okay, whatever you want to do, I don't care, just do your job. But then in 1998, a transnational corporation purchased this little company. And of course, the swamp wall was gone, and life actually got really lousy for the workers after that. Now, this family relation and his fellow workers had high school educations, but they did not attend college. And as far as I know, they never gone to an art gallery and art museum. In short, their messy collaborative frieze was not meant to be art. It was instead a silent expression of non-productivity that was visible only to those who had actually had business in that particular wing of the factory, an uninviting, sweat-soaked warehouse ruled by packing crates, forklifts, and tiers of loading pallets set far from the air-conditioned and product showrooms that were populated by white-collar workers, right, the plant managers. My point here is this. Consider how differently we think of artist Bozhkov's incredibly funny Walmart intervention as opposed to the curious artifact of daily detritus known as Swamp Wall, knowing that the latter was not intended for display in a museum or an art gallery, and certainly not rooted in any type of artistic intent or response. What I would contend is that Swamp Wall was a fantasy of autonomy. Going back now to the Kluge and Knecht point, right? It was a fantasy of autonomy or fantasy of autonomous labor, let's say. Right? And it made manifest a desire to direct some small portion of one's energy as one pleases. And it was a concrete representation of this desire for autonomy. It demonstrated the possibility of punching in to a company, you know, on a time clock, and at the same time being somewhere else, or at least part of the time. So that would be one of the examples I would give of this strange space or the strange gap between what we consider art and what we consider not art, and how those two things have for a long time been kept very far apart, and how I would say they've gradually become more and more complicated. So for example, think of the kind of images and objects that have been very successful in the art world over the last 25 years or so that really take advantage of this kind of informal amateur aesthetic. I'll give you some examples, because I'm sure you have some in mind. Thomas Hirschhorn, right? Here, there's two different projects here. One of them, I believe the one on the bottom is from the Bronx in New York, where he created the Gramsci Project. And the entire aesthetic that Hirschhorn uses, of course, comes from this do-it-yourself kind of almost street vocabulary or homeless person's art or whatever you want to call it, right? The second example, and I could come up with many, would be Sarah Lucas. You know, this is her gnome covered in cigarette butts. It's at the Tate under plexiglass. It's worth, you know, tremendous amount of money. But you could imagine this in some, you know, flea market somewhere in, you know, the southwest of the United States, some eccentric person just making these weird objects. Or think of someone like Jeff Koons, who recently, you know, sold one of his pieces sold for the largest amount of any contemporary artist. There's actually a sort of banner that hangs at LaGuardia Airport. I just love the way this looks, kind of strange. But again, taking like simple toy, right, and blowing it up. Anybody could make something like this now on a 3D printer, right? So where are these lines between artistic work and this informality? How has this kind of grown? I mean, we know that since the Renaissance, of course, the idea that the artist is different than the tactician, right? That this has been an important gap, and a gap that's kind of been pushed open in different ways. For example, the role between artist and artisan, let's say, or artist and craftsperson. Certainly since art's dematerialization was announced by Lucy R. Lepard, my friend, following her historic 1968 encounter with Tucumán Arte in Argentina. Right? And then several years later, when Ian Byrne, Australian artist and art historian, prophesized art's total de-skilling. These and other factors have led to something that has would have seemed impossible years ago. And that is that the art world's embrace of ephemeral, performative, but also now socially engaged and even activist art. And I find that the moment that we're in, and hopefully we can have a conversation around that a little bit. And I'll give you a couple of other examples. I want to give you this one crazy example. Just bear with me here. So for example, social practice art loves Post-it notes. Right? Every exhibition I go to now, there's Post-it notes. I wonder how like the Post-it note companies are doing with this, right? It must be incredible. I remember back, okay, sorry, I'm gonna just meander a little second. I went to the Whitney program in New York City, which is, you know, was very highly theoretical in the 1990s when I went, and it had been for many years. It was just shifting then. And people had tended to always do work that had no embodiment. It was very much coming out of a conceptual art framework. And we used to joke that like whenever the Whitney students had their sort of exhibition, the material that we called press type, you probably don't use this anymore. It was like a sheet of paper that had letters on it that you would rub down to do graphic design, vanished off the shelves in New York City because they were all using it to make their art on the walls of their studios, right? Now it's Post-it notes. So this is sort of social practice Post-it note art, but you know, there's a lot of people who do Post-it note art, right? And these are some examples of just other ways that people use Post-it notes to create sort of various kinds of meanings. Under such ontologically uncertain circumstances, maintaining the division between the inside and the outside of our familiar art world is becoming challenging or impossible, especially for those invested in policing the borders, putting those barricades in place. And I'll give you a second example, which is the phenomena I call the mock institution, or the mock-stitution, simply put, mock institution. These are informally structured and artistically invented agencies that overtly and often ironically mimic the name and the function of a larger, more established organizational entity, such as schools, bureaus, offices, laboratories, leagues, centers, departments, societies, clubs, even corporations, such as the Yes Men, who I probably don't need to introduce to you, but you know, they imitate various kinds of companies or corporations or whatever they have to do to create these kind of interventions. Right? Maybe the mock institution, in a sense, is actually a kind of imaginary establishment made out of the organizational equivalent of Post-it notes. I don't know, it's something I just thought of. In any case, this mock institutional aesthetic, which has been around for decades. I mean, it exists, you can go back to even the 50s, but certainly the 60s, you can find examples of it with General Idea and other groups like that. It really accelerated after the period that we were talking about, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of the socialist experiment, right, in the 1990s. And it came to fill the voids left over by an increasingly fractured international landscape, institutional landscape, whose social coherence was badly disintegrated by neoliberalization, neoliberal privatization, economic deregulation, and precariousness. But in another twist, these bogus organizations, these artist-invented mock institutions, often turn out to be better functioning organizations than the institutions they sought to mimic or mock. So in this neoliberal period, when the very idea of the social fabric and social institutions are being dismantled, and we have this in the United States probably much more accelerated than you do here, these phony organizations come along, and sometimes it's just two people with a website, right, and a corporate and a name that they've created. And they sort of are able to do things that those institutions used to be able to do and can no longer do, those real social institutions. It's as if they sort of picked up the sort of pieces of this broken society and sort of wore it like a kind of camouflage, and then found out ways to sort of move in between the interstices of the world, right? Very interesting ways. So mimicry, in other words, is pushed to the point of inversion, reaching all the way back to what was ironically being represented in the first place. And one wonders what would Plato and Socrates make of this, right? Plato and Socrates, who couldn't abide by artistic imitation, as we know from the 10th book. Theorist Stephen Wright offers another version of this phenomenon. And he observes that contemporary art is now scaling itself up to become identical with the world it once sought to represent. He describes this as a one-to-one relationship between art and the world. Now, some of you may have read his treatise on usership. It was written in part for Art Utile, Tanya Bergera's project. If you haven't, I recommend reading it. It's very interesting. I'll just give you a quote here. What do one-to-one practices look like? Well, they don't look like anything other than what they also are, nor are they something to be looked at, and they certainly don't look like art. One might well describe these practices as being positively redundant, as enacting a function already fulfilled by something else. I presented this to my graduate students the other day, and I think they're still just like scratching their heads. They don't know what to do with this. Under such circumstances, and if Wright is correct, and I believe he is, I think this phenomena, actually his phenomena that he describes, reflects this brightening of dark matter that I described, as it morphs into a weird deontological condition that also forces art's inherent social labor to become increasingly self-evident, both to itself and to the institutions that rely upon it. Therefore, in relation to Lopez Cuenca's thesis, one effect of neoliberalism's global triumph has been a shift in focus from the possibility of autonomous objects to an interest and a focus on autonomous labor. In addition, the mainstream art world's rising interest in social practice is, I suspect, a similar outgrowth of this no longer dark matter agency. But this process of unconcealment and apparent spurning of artistic representation and metaphor, right, this one-to-one scale, also parallels a condition that I describe as a bare art world. An art world stripped of its centuries-old privileged autonomy and sense of mystique. With apologies to Giorgio Agamben, contradictions lie visibly at the very surface of our bare art world. Right? And artistic bad consciousness is normalized and taken for granted. I don't think it's you can see the parallel, I guess I'm drawing here, to what's been happening in the political realm, particularly in places like the United States and Britain and Russia. Bare art survives one step beyond Adorno's bleak assessment of cultural compromise, evolving not into a representation of capital, nor of capital in its commodity stage, but into capital itself. Contemporary art conspicuously entwines itself with the laws of economics, value production, and therefore also with the chronic and ever more rapidly reoccurring political crisis of global capitalism. And in that process, it draws social labor out into visibility. And in this bare art world, we no longer can hide behind art's claims to autonomy, art's claims to mystery. And you'd think, okay, then resistance is futile. There's no hope. Like some character in an H.P. Lovecraft book where it like finally confronts the cosmic horror and knows there's nothing that can be done. But I don't believe that's true. I think actually we're in a position now where we can take advantage of that nakedness and do something rather extraordinary if we're willing to take that kind of risk. And I want to show you some examples of what I mean, and then we can have a conversation. I'm going to change this to this one. And where's our? Wow. Oh, okay. We can just put that one. So, thank you so much. One of the things that's happened. So after the 89 phase and then after the 2008 phase, what's happened, of course, more recently is something interesting. If I'm correct about this idea, dark matter gets brighter, we have a bare art world. Suddenly you have artists who went to school and studied with people like me and people like of a previous generation, even like Benjamin Buchloh and others, who talked about the idea of institutional critique, right? The idea that art should critique its own institutionality. And I would say that while I think some of that work is extremely important and I respect it, it is often also the problem that I talked about before, where it seems to be a kind of Brechtian de-alienation effect without any kind of politics. We could go more. But what's happened, I think, is a lot of those younger people, some of them have gotten jobs in institutions. Many of them work in places like this, in New York, in the New Museum, in the Guggenheim. The New Museum is made up of large numbers of people who have art degrees or who are practicing artists of one sort. I'm talking about the staff, right? Talk about people who make the museum literally work. And I think they've actually literally started to enact institutional critique, not in an artistic way in the gallery or whatever, but literally in their own practices, right? And it's not just that phase. There's another phase, which and there's kind of two elements. So that's the inside mutiny of the art world happening. There's an outside mutiny where people who are also often artistically trained are working with activist collectives and groups and movements to push the art world to do something else. And I'm going to hit you a few examples. One is Decolonize This Place, which is a group that's been staging interventions in various museums. And I'm going to skip through a few slides because this is not quite what I had, but institutional critique. Hans Hake's famous poll where he went to the Museum of Modern Art, had people actually drop, ballots in or questionnaires about their politics, about their economics, and so on and so forth, and looking at who is inside the art world. This is all the way back in like 1974, maybe, or of course Andrea Frazier, or Art Workers Coalition. Again, Art Workers Coalition after Hans Hake's show was canceled. Yvonne Rainier, the dancer and filmmaker, led a conga line down the ramp of the Guggenheim. Art Workers Coalition intervening when, you remember, Guernica was still at the Museum of Modern Art for many years. because Picasso wouldn't let it return to Spain until Franco was gone. And they went and they did, they're holding up posters against the Vietnam War, right, in 1968 or 69. So you have this new wave, okay? This is the 60s, jump forward to the 2008, 2009, the post-crash, and you have a younger group of artists, including one called BFA, MFA, PhD, who ask, you know, what are we doing spending all this money on art, right? On art degrees, and asking the question, well, what if we just used that money to buy a house and made our art, right? They did surveys. I don't know how absolutely scientifically accurate these surveys are, but they at least raise the question in a symbolic sense, like what is this industry that we're supposed to be part of and what is our role in it? Another group is WAGE, Working Artists for the Greater Economy. And they've actually come up with a system in which this is for like any institution that gets money from the government can get themselves certified. So they have a wage certification saying that they pay their artists a fair wage, right? I really don't know how it works here all that well. In the US, unfortunately, most of the art world, of course, is commercial. So they're working in the area of the not-for-profit. But those not-for-profits that do exist often say to the artist, well, you don't get paid, you have an exhibition. What do you need to be paid for, right? And so they're saying, no, wait a minute, you know, this should be a standard practice and this is how it should work. And they've slowly gotten institutions to sort of join in this. I told you about institutional critique coming home to roost. New Museum, right? Once a champion of political art, and I'm happy to say they're actually hosting an exhibition of my former professor, Hans Hake, my friend, at work in a few weeks, opening. Only the second time he's ever had an exhibition in the United States, and the first one was also at New Museum. But in the meantime, the workers, who I told you were mostly artists, decided to create a union. They wanted a union. They wanted to get paid better. And you know what the museum did? They hired a company that explicitly carries out anti-union activity. When we take action, you take control. In other words, we're going to find a way to dismantle this union before it gets off the ground. Specifically, urgent services, counter-union campaigns, right? Union avoidance training. And nevertheless, the workers voted to have a union. And now the difficult part is, of course, negotiating the contracts and whatever. They couldn't stop them, which was quite interesting. This has also just happened at the Guggenheim Museum in New York as well since then. And it's starting to spread through other museums. Again, this idea that a certain kind of institutional critique is like coming home to roost, right? By the people who like literally studied it as students. There are other groups which you can look into. Debt Fair is one of them that came out of the Occupy movement, because another part of our history here from 89 to 2008 to 2011 has to be that moment when the creative class, who thought their future was going to be like this very interesting, kind of like versatile, flexible future, suddenly found out they had no future. And they went into the sort of public squares around the world and said, wait a minute, stop the clock, right? Unlike when Benjamin talks about shooting out the clocks, right, in the Paris the Revolution, the French Revolution, here we had students and workers, very young creatives. Richard Florida, right, his creative class going into the public squares and taking control. Out of that came a lot of things, even though it may not have succeeded in its own terms, although they never really had any demands to begin with. One of them is Debt Fair, which talks about the enormous debt that artists face and tries to manifest that. They were invited to the Whitney Biennial, and again, these are the ironies and twists of all this. And they tore away the wall, made it look like it was torn away, to show all the artists who would never have been in the biennial, and they also had each one of them list the debt that they went into to get their MFA. In the United States, you can go into debt $80, $90, $100,000 to get a Master's of Fine Art. Not at my school, but my school's still expensive. And there have been other protests against board members, Larry Fink at the MoMA, who actually owns one of these companies that owns everybody's debt. Decolonize This Place, which goes into museums, which goes into the Whitney Museum. And this is one of the last things I'm going to show you, is Warren Kanders, who was a board member at the Whitney, at the Whitney Museum in New York. You probably read about this, but I'll just recap it. Turns out Mr. Kanders owns a company called Safariland, and Safariland makes tear gas canisters and other so-called non-lethal weapons, which have been used in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip against Palestinians by the Israelis, which were being used on the border against the so-called migrant caravan that was coming up and threatening the United States. This poor, men and women and children. And these same tear gas canisters were being thrown at these people by our military in the United States. He's on the board of the Whitney. I think it was 100 people wrote a letter, 100 staff members at the Whitney wrote a letter saying, we want him off the board of directors. Now, that's a very bold thing. They are not unionized. And there's hundreds and hundreds of people who would like to have a job at the Whitney Museum. They could have just said, okay, sorry, you're out, They took the step, took a very bold step. Then they got public attention, and then this collective decolonize this place went in and did actions inside the museum, outside the museum. This is Mr. Kanders, the board member's company, its website. Excuse me, in the bottom. Just a contrast there. It began when there was the Warhol exhibition at the museum. Outside, preparing to go in, and then just some sketches that I made while this was taking place, kind of live. The museum didn't stop people from entering, but they tried to sort of take away people's banners, and then basically they had to kind of give in. What the activists did, and I wasn't part of this planning group, was in a way to sort of parallel the tear gas, they had a big pot of sage, which is an herb, of course, and you burn it, and a lot of native indigenous people use it to sort of purify buildings. They just set this on fire inside the lobby of the museum, and pretty soon the lobby filled with smoke. But you have to remember, there's lines of people coming to go to the exhibition at the same time, and they're like, what's going on here? Demonstrators over here, smoke filling the room. I have to say, for the museum's part, they cleverly decided not to call the police. They told them to stay away, but they called the fire department. And the fire department came and said, okay, we have to put out this fire, whatever. That was the first demonstration. There were many more after. Here you see the NYPD down the street, not getting near. They've created artwork, in this case, of course, using Warhol to talk about the Whitney, stickers, and so on and so forth. And actually, this is a canister, forensic architecture. The collective made a movie about the canister. This is, I think, from the Gaza Strip. So, how much time do I have? I don't got time for like maybe one more example. Okay, good. But I want to make sure we have time to talk. So, I love this is Pablo Helguera, my friend from the MoMA, works at the MoMA as an artist. You probably know that the Guggenheim Museum, for many years now, has tried to expand itself into different ways, right? Creating clones of itself, whatever. About 10 years, it's not quite 10 years ago, about 8 years ago, they decided to work on a project in Abu Dhabi, in United Arab Emirates. And you may know that in Abu Dhabi, and in that whole region, really, in India, etc., the Middle East, Northern Africa, if you're a worker, if you want to like make extra money, you go to a place like Abu Dhabi, you go to UAE, Dubai, Sharjah, whatever, where you can make a lot more money, it seems, and send that money back to your family. You get recruited by someone who you pay basically a visa fee for. You have to pay a visa fee too, and then you go there. You discover, first of all, that not only are the working conditions much worse than what you thought, not only is the pay not what you thought, they take your passport away so you can't leave, and then you actually have to pay back that recruitment fee, which can take 2 or 3 years. So none of the money you thought you were going to send to your family is happening. This is the place, this is the region where the Guggenheim has decided to build an amazingly huge and unique new Frank Gehry, the star architect, building Guggenheim on an island called Saadiyat Island. Right? So a group of people, and I'm part of this group called Gulf Labor Coalition, said, wait a minute, you can't do this without trying to give the workers the kind of labor rights that you would have in the United States, in North America, in Europe, etc. And the Guggenheim said, of course, we want the workers to have good rights. They're good liberal people, but it's just not our problem. It's the United Arab Emirates problem. We can't. We're just a little group. We said, well, you're not giving them your logo, your marketing, your branding. Well, yeah. So we called for a boycott. Not a boycott of the Guggenheim per se, but a boycott of anybody showing work at this new museum. Now, they wanted, of course, to fill the new museum with artworks by people from the Middle East. Most of the artists who were sort of like high profile from the Middle East signed the boycott, including Walid Rad, Emily Jassir, and others, right? So they had a problem. Then they said, okay, well, come and talk to us. Let's have another conversation. Conversations went on back and forth with the director, Richard Armstrong, and others. We went to these meetings, and it was always the same thing. We really want to make change, and then nothing would happen. So then we called on a new project. In 2015, we called for something called 52 weeks of Gulf labor. In other words, every single day, a week of the year, someone would do a project about this problem. It could just be online, it could be whatever. And all kinds of people, including Thomas Hirshhorn, Andrea Fraser, others, and lots of people you don't know, created projects, including the Illuminators, which is it's a group based in New York, and they have this sort of big ass, projector on top of a truck, because technically it's illegal to project on the buildings for various reasons. So they drive around, project onto a building, and then of course if the police come, they can scoot away. Here's what Frank Gehry wanted to build. It's enormous. And I was there in Sharjah and I saw this model, took pictures of it. This isn't my picture. This is a fantasy image of what the island would look like. The island, when I visited it in, was it 2012, I think, was just a desert island. I mean, literally a desert island, like you saw in Pablo's drawing. They're terraforming this, right? Like Jeff Bezos wants to terraform Mars. They're terraforming this island so that it can become a place for the super wealthy. You'll buy real estate there. You'll send your kid, kids can go to the museum. There'll be golf courses. They'll go to the best schools, including New York University, which already had a facility in Abu Dhabi, and they'll be opening a new one if they haven't already on the island. And that disc you saw off to the side is the new Louvre. So it wasn't just the Guggenheim, it was the British Museum, the Louvre, and other museums that were being invited. Saadiyat Island, I did take this picture on the way in, it means island of happiness. I also took this picture when we were at one of the meetings at the Guggenheim because I thought of Dr. No. This is the Guggenheim's own plastic map showing its locations around the world. Today, we are calling on artists and activists who are concerned with the rights of laborers in the Gulf region of the Middle East and elsewhere to help us storm the new palaces of the super rich. This is some of the Human Rights Watch and other NGO brochures and studies of the workers who are trying or building things in that region. I think Walid Rad took this picture just to show you the kind of living conditions that are there. The Guardian and other newspapers, the New York Times, everyone has reported on how bad the conditions are for workers. We visited the workers' housing. This is the ideal housing. This is what they wanted to show us, so they could say, this is how good it is here, right? And it's kind of like a concentration camp. And remember, you're in the middle of a desert. You have no family around you. There's really nowhere to go, and you have to kind of sign in and sign out with electronic equipment. So 52 weeks of Gulf labor, various projects happened, and I decided to do one with my colleague and former student graduate from our MFA program, Matthew Greco. And Matt runs 3D printing. And so we had this idea. Around Christmas, Hanukkah, the Guggenheim brings this wonderful tchotchke out. It's a little version of the Frank Lloyd Wright building. You can buy it for a reasonable amount of money, and you can hang it on your Hanukkah tree, your Christmas tree. So we thought, well, why don't we try doing something similar? Let's make some little Saadiyat Island workers housing tchotchkes, which we did. We 3D printed them from the picture I took put them in little plastic containers. We added our own text, which is more or less what I've been describing to you in the last few minutes. And we took a bunch of these down to the gift shop at the Guggenheim on Fifth Avenue, where we dropped them. Shop dropping is the opposite of shoplifting. Now, here's the thing that's really crazy. We put them in, there's a couple gift shops in the building. We put them in different places, stacked them up. A couple of days later, someone said they had been in the museum and they said, you know, those are still there. And it was like, really? Why? So either the workers in the gift shop were like into it and thought, okay, let's just let this go, or they just didn't realize that this was an intervention. We had scanned the UPC code from the actual product, so it's even possible they sold some of these things, right? Sooner or later, they figured out and took them out. Anyway, that was one little intervention. And then another group formed out of our bigger group, sort of budded off of it, called Global Ultra Luxury Faction, or GULF. And GULF is much more dedicated to direct intervention. So on May Day, May 1st, 2015, we decided to do an intervention. And the woman sitting in the wheelchair is not disabled. She's actually sitting on a parachute with words written on it at 10 a.m. that morning. This was the pre-warm-up around the Met Museum. We went over to the Guggenheim, got inside the Guggenheim. At 10 a.m., we pulled out the banner. And Meet Workers' Demands, like that. Down in the lobby of the museum, a rain of like flyers came down to tell people what was kind of going on, different languages, different types of artwork. This is made by Noah Fisher, the group, brilliant artist. Very quickly, the security people tore the banner apart. But we decided not to leave. Like the action hadn't ended. We decided we were going to occupy the museum, which was the first time this was tried. So we sat in a circle. The museum decided quickly, okay, first of all, they called the police. Outside there were people giving support. Inside we huddled together. They called the police, and they also decided not to let anybody else into the museum. This was the last day, I think, of the On Carrara exhibition, the retrospective. And so eventually the museum just emptied of people, and we just sat there. The police came, and they told us, you know, we're just waiting for the van. And we whispered amongst ourselves, and we said, well, wait a minute. Does the museum really want to have a picture of a bunch of artists being let out in handcuffs from the museum? I don't think so. We didn't think so, so we stayed. What made it a little bit more complicated and edgy was 3 or 4 of us had tickets to go to the Venice Biennale the next day. And if we were put in prison overnight or even held up for a few hours, that would probably be a goner. I'll explain why we were going there. Eventually, the police left. We stayed there till the end of the day. We had the whole museum to ourselves, except for the security guards. It's kind of interesting. Wandered around, saw the shows that you could never see like alone. And then at 4 o'clock, we said we won and we left. But we hadn't finished. What we wanted as a group was to get the board members of the Guggenheim to come and meet with us. We'd never met with the board members because we felt we had to go above Richard Armstrong, the director, to get something done. The late Oakley and Weser had invited us to the Biennale in Venice, not GULF, this activist group part of it, this budding part, this faction, but GULF Labor. And so we created a project for him, but then GULF arrived, and with the help of people from Sally Docks, which is a really amazing, wonderful collective in Venice. If you don't know it, you should. We decided to do another action, again, to get the board members on board. This is a sort of remake of a Whistler drawing. We did do something in the Arsenale because Oakley insisted we have something on display, but this was our real plan of action. Marco Baravalli and the other people at Sally Docks got some little boats, and then we went around the Grand Canal with a bunch of sort of materials, posters, banners, and we took over the Peggy Guggenheim Museum, the dock that sits in the water. Right? And we took it over, and at the end of the day, the United States was going to have its opening for the Venice Biennale. And of course, they wanted to get rid of us as soon as they could. So sooner or later, eventually, they had to do something. Around 2 hours in, we saw the police come, and we thought, oh shit. But then you notice one of them is saluting us, and we realized it was just another art project. Eventually, the museum gave up. We won. We did this kind of grand shot. They said they would let the board members meet with us when we get back to New York, which they did. We did a lot of work with them to try to show them how contracts could be made for the workers. And then about a month later, they said, we're not doing anything else with Gulf labor. Everything's off. The illuminators came back out and said, you just like all this work we've done, you just broke it. Probably part of the story is that the oil prices had crashed at that moment. This is like 2016, and maybe the Abu Dhabi and those other countries, they were sort of slowing down their cultural program. We don't know. We keep hearing it's coming back. We keep waiting to go back into action. So that's the last thing I'm going to show you and say. And now we can open it up maybe to discussion. But when you take over a museum, you get to do things like this, take pictures like this. Okay, thank you very much. It's difficult to see through the light, but if you have questions, just...
I might have to give you a hand.
Please.
Pues si quieren abrimos una sesión de intercambio, de reflexiones y de preguntas con Greg. Me gustaría empezar a mí, ya que tengo el micrófono en la mano, porque Greg ha enfatizado como dos momentos importantes, 89 y 2008 en su relato. I might translate this a little bit. En su relato, que me parece importante, en la reconfiguración de lo que estaba narrando. Me gustaría plantear quizás dos preguntas inicialmente. Una tendría que ver con, es muy interesante esa dimensión biográfica que contaba de cuando llega a Nueva York, ¿no? En los 80. Él forma parte en ese periodo de un colectivo, ¿no? Del Political Art Documentation Distribution, que funciona entre 1980 y el 88. Pero es interesante porque dice, cuando llegamos a Nueva York, en realidad la imagen que se tenía, o digamos la imaginación pública al respecto del arte político, era el realismo socialista. Entonces, la primera pregunta que me gustaría plantearle tiene que ver cómo cambió ese imaginario, ¿no? en el trabajo que ellos hacen en ese lapso temporal. So I'm very much interested about this kind of biographical, actually. But by the time you get into New York City, you said at some point that political art was related to social realism, right? But the work you guys did with the political art documentation distribution in the 80s, I think it changed that idea about what political art was.
I think it was part of a wave of change. It was one part of it.
All right.
Yeah.
How would you describe the kind of transformation? Because I think for the 1990s that was already accepted, this kind of neo-conceptual turn into art, this kind of a strategy you were describing with.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it needs more research, but one thing I can say is that one of the founding members of PADD was Lucy Lepard, who is well known for, again, going back to Tucumán Arde, she was kind of politicized in some ways through that to think about art in political terms. And Lucy was involved in Art Workers Coalition, Heresies Collective, and many collectives. She was also writing for the Village Voice at the time. So she had an outlet, a media outlet. And one of the reasons that she actually got fired from The Voice after about a year or so was because she was mixing together her work as an activist and her supposed objectivity as a critic. But because of that platform, she was able to kind of keep putting out these ideas. And I think that actually had a lot to do with it. It reached a lot of people in New York, and they started to think about this question. It was simultaneous with other things going on. The anti-nuclear power and nuclear weapons movement was very powerful coming out of the 70s. And of course, the intervention that was planned to take place in Central America by Ronald Reagan, the Contras in Honduras and El Salvador, which a lot of us got involved with, I think also helped politicize a lot of people. So I think there were a lot of convergences. Maybe on another level though, Alberto, it was also those of us who had studied with people like Hans Hacke, Joseph Kosuth, a lot of people who had thought about these issues and whose work in some cases was political, but it was still kind of political in a context of art. And I think having seen Hans Hacke's work getting censored, some of us also thought, well, wait a minute, let's just do it somewhere else. Let's create our own collectives. Let's create our own spaces. Let's do it in the street. And I think all of that sort of starts to come together in the late 80s, early 90s.
Hay una pregunta intermedia, quizás antes de llegar a 2008, que tendría que ver con cómo precisamente, a pesar de que se configuran estos espacios y estas iniciativas que estaba describiendo ahora Greg, que podíamos calificar como autogestivas en la medida en que no estaban inscritas en instituciones, no abandonan esta presión sobre las instituciones. Eso es interesante, que viene en la parte final de su relato, pero creo que sería interesante quizás indagar un poco en qué consiste esa tensión, ¿no? entre espacios que son autogestivos, que tienen una clara orientación política, que cuentan, decía Greg en un momento, bueno, nos interesaba una historia que no había sido relatada, ¿no? Y unas formas de organización y de trabajar en el ámbito artístico que estaban como en ese dark matter, ¿no? Como en este espacio oscuro, ¿no? Que no parecía ser relevante. There's something that is very interesting in the narration you put forward. You never gave up in this kind of a struggle against mainstream institutions. Like, I mean, one would think, you know, if you organize by yourself, you have your own space, you are like publishing and editing, you are kind of producing this kind of dark side narrative. You guys never stopped fighting or struggling with the mainstream institution. Why didn't you decide, you know, we have our I don't know, self-organized art world that runs parallel to this big, large institution? Why you thought there was something at stake there?
Okay, so PADD, and this is going to come back to your thesis point, your pivot point in a way. This group PADD really does come out of the old, let's call it the old new left, can we say that? Or the new left, right? So post-68 left, which definitely tried to deconstruct the sort of, you know, heavily centralized, let's say, Communist Party model, whatever, Trotskyist, whatever you want to say, but was still sort of centralized, right? And patriarchal and so on and so forth, right? And so PADD actually inherited some of this kind of political structure. I have another lecture where I literally have diagrams that we created at the time to show how this works, right? So we had a central group that, you know, little groups would then bring their ideas to, and there would be kind of a voting thing. It would look like the Comintern, basically, right? I called it Leninism light. I think that model went hand in hand with PAD's belief that we could create an alternative art world on the left that would be in solidarity with liberatory movements around the world, decolonial movements, and so on and so forth. And it would use union halls, even churches, anyone involved in those kind of countercultural projects. And we would string it together using newsletters, there was no internet, archives, exhibitions, and really create a kind of left cultural sphere. I think that completely collapses after '89. And that whole model pretty much disintegrates. And what takes its place is something closer to, let's say, this wouldn't have been used right away, but tactical media, the model of tactical media, which is to say you create a kind of institution maybe, but it's never really an institution. It imitates something, maybe it jumps, like the Yes Men are a really good example. You jump into something and you pretend to be an organization with an institutional structure, but you're really doing it just to kind of create this kind of moment where you reveal the politics of a corporation or a company or a government, and then you vanish again and then you reconstitute over there as something else. In other words, you never hold any ground. You're constantly moving. And I think that model replaces or displaces the one where you think, okay, let's hold our own ground over here. Okay, so this is one piece of the answer to what you're saying. That, of course, becomes accelerated with the internet, cyberspace, all the hopes that were in that. This is why tactical media was also electronic, So Ricardo Dominguez would be, one of the people, Steve Kurtz in the critical art, and so all these people doing these kind of, but never claiming a separate space, really, claiming only to be able to kind of make these interventions. Very, very different than the group PADD that I was part of, I think. And maybe not so different than the neoliberal model, in an ironic way, where you are now a worker who must constantly re-educate yourself. You're precarious. You're going to do this job this week. You're going to do that job next week. You're never going to really hold your own space, right? And so there is a parallel there. I'm not saying, and I don't want to discredit tactical media and simply say, oh, it was like a neoliberal moment. No, but I think that there were definitely parallels between the two. Those of us who were sort of involved in Gulf labor and whatever, I think we come out of both of those trends. People like Walid Rod and Andrew Ross and others who really created Gulf labor, I think they come out of their older generation, they kind of come out of both of those tendencies. So, yeah.
Es muy interesante en el relato que Greg nos comparte, las formas de organización que se habrían articulado en los 80, ¿no? en torno a los colectivos que estaba describiendo originalmente, de alguna manera dice que quedan como desarticulados en esta lógica que estaría articulada con las estrategias propias de lo que se llamó New Left, ¿no? Y que en realidad lo que en los 90, sobre todo cruzado con el auge del capitalismo digital, ¿no? Lo que produjo fueron ciertas formas asociadas con lo que se denominó tactical media, y que en realidad eso de alguna manera equiparaba o alineaba mucho más las formas de organización y de respuesta a las propias lógicas que fijaban, ¿no? Las condiciones desplegadas por el capitalismo digital. Y esto me lleva a la última observación o pregunta que me gustaría compartirle, que es el argumento que él plantea de lo que llama las intervenciones escala 1-1, tomando la idea esta de Stephen Wright, ¿no? O lo que llama el nudo mundo del arte, o el mundo del arte desnudo, ¿no? The bare art wall, ¿no? Digamos, en un guiño obviamente a Agamben, ¿no? Donde creo que a donde está apuntando es que no hay ya ningún tipo de... Hay una suerte de aplanamiento en las formas que las instituciones culturales, artísticas y la propia lógica con la que opera el mundo del arte no genera en realidad un espacio autónomo, distintivo, sino como en los últimos casos que describía, en realidad ha aplanado las condiciones materiales en las que producen tanto los artistas como eso que llaman artistas amateurs o domingueros, con esos que operarían en el mundo del arte. So my last question have to be probably thinking in chronological terms about 2008. There's something that you call the bare art wall, no? This kind of naked art wall, let's say. And this idea that you are taking from Stephen Wright about the scale 1.0, no, the 1-1 scale, let's say, it caught my attention that, so what kind of you are pointing to here is this kind of flat materialistic relationship in which there's no really real deep separation between the art wall and, everyday material, no surviving conditions. But it caught my attention that the kind of strategies you have been putting forward, like the strategies that artists or activists are developing in that context, are very close to trade union strategies. I mean, these kind of strategies that seem to belong on forms of organization that seem to belong or that are more related probably to this kind of new left ideas, not pre-1989. Or maybe you have some other cases in mind. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that it's an interesting point, and I haven't really thought that through. So this would be a good conversation to have. But you're right insofar as I think a lot of the models do harken back to what Hans Hacke, Lucy Lepard, these people were doing with Art Workers Coalition. So the Art Workers Coalition said, we are workers, we are art workers. And we have a relationship to the museum and to the art world that's similar to a trade union. And they made 13 demands in 1969, I think the demands came out. And that included, artists should have the right to withdraw their work from an exhibition if they don't like the politics of it. They should be allowed to fix their artwork, repair it. AWC, Art Workers Coalition, actually got started because one artist, he actually just died, a Greek artist named Takis. His work was actually manipulated by the museum. And all these artists said, well, you can't just mess with an artwork. Just because you own it doesn't mean you have the right to change it. And so they made these demands. Interestingly enough, one of the demands was the museum should actually deaccession, sell off work by a certain number of their well-known artists and create a social security fund for living artists, right? So the demands were very much like, we're the workers, we provide the commodity, you're the institution, you're the capitalist, let's say, or you're the owner, you need to kind of treat us this way. The demands also expanded issues around race, around feminism, around the war, so it became politicized. But that was the core, was exactly what you're talking about. I think to some degree, at least the groups that I've been associated with, you could do a chronology or a genealogy, it comes right out of that. So Hans Hake was my professor. Walid Rod was Hans' colleague at Cooper Union. Wage, this group got their ideas from the Canadian model of compensating artists, right? And the Canadian model actually comes out of another art workers coalition like group that started in '68 by artists in Canada. I mean, if one could do this kind of thing and show at least this thread of what I'm talking about, absolutely direct connections between these models. So yeah, I mean, you're right. We maybe we hold on to a little bit of a nostalgia for the possibility of seeing a better treatment for artists and politically. I do think, though, the decolonized groups and some of the younger activists take this a lot further. When they demand that Warren Kanders or another board member steps out of the museum, they're not just saying, you need to behave better towards us. They're basically saying, we're going to pull the rug out from your entire idea of what an institution is. You take away the rich people off the boards of museums in the United States, you don't have any more museums. They're gone. And so I think there has been, in that phase of it, there's been a kind of real sea change.
Pues si tienen ustedes preguntas, adelante, ahora es cuando. Comentarios o reflexiones a partir de la presentación de Greg. Yo creo que tenemos unos minutos para ello. Las pueden hacer en español y si quieren yo les traduzco.
Could we put the lights up a little bit so we can see each other? Is that
I'm not sure we can do that because we are doing streaming, right? ¿Podemos bajar la luz tantito o porque estamos con el streaming tenemos que estar aquí cegados? Ah, no, your claim went through.
Bueno. ¿Eso no? Hi, Greg. Thank you for your conference. Well, my question is like, which difference do you see in the scenario that you're presenting us to moment of museum versus artist now, at least in New York?
I think it's a very tricky moment because, as I said before, there's a lot of demands to decolonize the museum. And I think it's an important statement to make, but I also think the museums are inherently colonial projects for the most part. And I think when you take away that part of it, you have to ask what's left, right? So we're in a position where we need to either rethink the museum, radically rethink what the museum is, or acknowledge that in part we're demanding the end of what we think of as museums, and I don't know what happens, after that. I do think a lot of the boycotts that we see, not just the one we started, Gulf Labor, but all these other ones, I do think that they kind of point to a space beyond artistic practice, that we can't actually see. It's like Malevich's Black Square, it seems to stand for a whole lot, but we don't see what it is. I feel like we're kind of at that point of a kind of zero aesthetic where there's a demand being made for something we want to see happen, but we can't articulate what it is. So we refuse, we withdraw, we say boycott. But in most cases, we don't boycott completely. We continue to engage. So as Mariam Ghani, one of the members of Gulf Labor, said, it's engagement through disengagement. And I think that's the state we're in with some of these struggles. I say that, and I'm also involved. I have some work that I do with the MoMA. Friends are in exhibitions at the Whitney. So I'm not condemning all these museums. I'm so happy to see Hans Hacke's show is going to be at the new museum. I mean, I'm really pleased. So, we live in this environment. We can't completely choke ourselves off from it either.
What do you think is the role of art institutions and art museums nowadays?
Yeah, I think that it's an important role because I think they have to grasp this moment. And if I'm correct, this kind of bare art moment, and recognize, that the kind of the world of autonomy and the mystery of the art museum has been sort of exposed. And so that's not really a good option. I mean, I still love going to museums. I love going to the Met and, looking at Renaissance art. But I think for us contemporary people, we have to acknowledge that something very raw has happened to the art market. It's becoming a kind of planetary sort of market. It's like the largest, pretty much, maybe the largest unregulated financial market in the world, right? If you've read Hito Stierl's work on free ports, I recommend her book on free ports. You just see this sort of phenomenal morphing that's going on in the art world that reflects these kind of changes. So I think for people who are involved in museums, they need to sort of, I think, grasp the situation and then think about ways that they can address it without succumbing to it. A lot of museums now are doing the social practice thing. It's like the post-it note moment, it seems. And it's great. I think it's great that people do this. Even the Guggenheim has a social practice program now, right? They would never, of course, invite Gulf Labor to be part of that. We know that for a fact. But, good, do these things. This is good. But don't just take this moment of social labor being so raw and obvious and exposed and like exploit it in the sense that, okay, we can do a show. People love things that move around. So we'll do a choreographed art project. And we won't have any work that we have to worry about maintaining because it disappears once it's done. And the artists will do this exciting thing and the community will come. It becomes, programming is replacing curatorial work, right, in the classic sense. And I think we need to recognize what that is and what that means. Yes, the museums are changing and morphing, but if they're just becoming a kind of facet of this larger planetary art economy without reflecting on it, I think it's very problematic. And what's going to happen as neoliberalism, which is in crisis, obviously, collapses as it's collapsing, and we see this turn towards the nationalist capitalism that's where will the museums fit into that picture? That's a really interesting and scary question, I think.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah. ¿Alguien pide la palabra? Ah, sí, adelante.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering, what about or how to think this idea of decolonizing the museums in places like this? I mean, I know that the notion and the concept of the museum that we use is based in these models of colonial history. But at the same time, the structures and the systems of museums outside, let's say, the States, Europe, work in different way. And in another way, they create other narratives, other histories. So I don't know if we can work in the same way with this notion of decolonizing art in places in which we're working in this kind of ruins and we're working in different forms. I mean, not all the museums at least in Latin America, work in this system of economy of the market. Most of the museums in Latin America, some of them at least, they produce works of art that will not be shown elsewhere but in the museums. So the institutions work in another form as well. So I don't know if it will be this notion of decolonizing the institutions here or in Africa or let's say other places in the world, how they can work, or if it's the same logic or.
No, you're absolutely right. I don't want to make it sound like it's, all museums or all art, local art situations are the same. I think they're all connected, but it doesn't mean they're all necessarily structured by the same conditions. Although interestingly, it was someone from South Africa when I was giving a talk like this in Amsterdam who said, we're trying to decolonize our museums in Cape Town, or it might have been Joburg. And I said, you think it's even possible? And I said, I'm not sure it's possible. When you think about these histories that are involved, indigenous people's rights and all these things. But I think that you're right, that there are different kinds of contexts, different local economies, and you have to protect. I think in a way, one of the answers maybe to your question is you have to protect these things from becoming absorbed into that bigger structure. Somehow, put some barricades up, going back to my title, so, but that's a very good point. And I don't know the conditions, so I can't really speak to them in depth.
Hello. Here. Thank you, Gregor, for your words. I just have a quick question. Taking into account the precarization of the art workers that you were talking us about, and for example, your work in the collective and all the performances artists can make to put pressure on institutions. However, how do you think about the open access possibilities to, for example, counteract this reproduction of the neoliberal system in the art world?
Yeah, I mean, I in the original writings I did 10 years ago or more around this idea of dark matter, I threw out the idea, what if we could imagine like a P2P, peer-to-peer art world? Like how would that operate? So we don't have the gatekeeper structures, the big galleries and museums, telling us which artists are allowed to sort of, filter into the light and which are not. That seemed like it was a great, possibility, along with the idea of free software, open source, and all these ideas. And I think a lot of people have tried to operate in that way, that I know, people like Stephen Wright and Gerald Rowning and other thinkers and theorists and a lot of collectives. But I do see, sadly, and I'm not an expert on this media area, but I do see, sadly, it seems that a lot of these ideas have started to become enclosed, so that instead of it being like really open, it's really a little bit more like a subscription plan where you get something for free, but then after a while you start having to pay for it, right? You have to start becoming a member. And it seems like a lot of the ideas behind that original thinking are becoming more and more sort of trapped within sort of a certain kind of effective capitalist or digital economy. So that seems to me an area of confrontation that really, along with this question of protecting museum culture of a certain kind, that would be an area I think that needs to be really thought and fought, you know. But it's difficult. I mean, we know, you know. I mean, I use Amazon. I know it's embarrassing, but I do. It's like convenient where I live. It's we are getting more and more sort of caught up in a certain kind of subscription mentality, right? So so yes, I agree with you, but I don't know how to make it survive at this particular moment.
Let me try to make a connection here between this idea of open access and the 1.1 scale, right, relationship, and the place the museum could take there. I think it's very interesting, because if we think about the history of the history of the museum as a bourgeois institution, that basically what, if we follow what John Berger used to say, right, about the museum as the museum basically is like the warehouse of the bourgeoisie, right, where they keep their paintings and the sculptures. And so this museum had to choose, make selections regarding authorship, the topics, whatever. So it's not a 1.1 relationship here. No, it's like there's a disproportion in the scale of the relationship with what cultural production is putting forward and what the museum can absorb or take. I guess the bourgeoisie would have liked to take everything, but they just couldn't, because they have to make a selection because of the very material condition of in which art was being produced. But in the digital transformation that took place in the 1990s, things change, because the ontology of culture responds in a different way to the art market at the museum. What I'm trying to say, that probably the scale now could approach this 1.1 relationship you're talking about, in which you don't have to choose. The museum is just this kind of a speedway in which, and this is very interesting, and the museum has to basically becomes a node in which a lot, tons of information, very divergent, very diverse, run through it, so to speak. So the question here is very interesting, because on the one hand, one could think that liberal notions like authorship, property, could be put into question because of this change in the scale within the museum. But at the same time, what you just said is we have new forms of enclosure, in which this kind of scale is not working anyway. What do you think about this tension, and where the museum can be located in this new scale 1.1 that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, coming back to your point, there was discussion around the idea of the long tail. I've got diagrams of it somewhere, but basically, think of a very tall pyramid going out to a foot, but rather than like a pyramid like this, it drags down and it spreads very, 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 very wide. And actually, the foot of the pyramid is now as large as the pyramid is tall. So in the day when you had to have brick and mortar buildings, let's say, and you would have books, to use an example, and you could only have so many books, obviously. But in the digital age, you could have an infinite number of books. Same with music. So the long tail, which is like every conceivable possible entry digitized somewhere, is the space in which, as you say, a horizontal museum, concept could exist. And you can go, you listen to the, your most popular bands or whatever, but you could find the most obscure bits of music all the way out in that tail somewhere. And that was this model that was being put forward as a possibility, again, like a peer-to-peer model in a way, as long as you recognize the long tail's value, right? And I think that was a radical kind of, still somewhat capitalist, but still a kind of a radical nudge at this idea. And yes, exactly. Think about that in terms of the art world. But the problem, I think, is that the art world has started to kind of catch up with a lot of this utopian thinking from the 90s, right? And all of this idea of technology. And it's starting to reintroduce the very same ideas about selection, hierarchy into all of this utopian thinking. It's not that it isn't still there. A great example is the artist and archivist Mark Fisher, who's in Chicago, who has this incredible archive of things. you know, the most obscure punk bands that you've ever imagined. He's got all kinds of things that he tries to kind of put together in this very horizontal archive, not just punk bands, strange artworks and groups. And so it's a kind of example of what you talked about. But they're rare, more and more rare. And what we still sort of want to impose, or the art market, given its incredible power and strength, wants to impose some kind of hierarchy, even on this. It's like a contradiction, right? Because the ability to do this is now more and more possible, to have this kind of horizontality. And yet the art market more and more wants to figure out, well, how do we go back to creating some notion of a hierarchy within it, right? And yeah, that is a battle. It's an edge. Yeah.
Tenemos tiempo para algunas preguntas más, si quieren. Pero ordenadamente, no todas de golpe.
So what are some of the issues here? I mean, I've heard a few things about museums, about the MUAC itself. What things come to your mind that you're struggling with, or that you feel need to be sort of addressed? Because many of you are art students, or art history students, or theorists, right? I'm putting you on the spot.
I would like to recover Elena's question regarding the decolonization in Latin America, and what would that mean, like in museum practices and in the, I don't know, the different ways in which we can understand different museological traditions. Your idea about mock institutions related to these critical artist projects, I think that sometimes in Mexico, at least, or from sort of the deceptive idea of certain things, like, are the actual institutions? Um, I would think that probably certain museums here in Mexico, certain images of the culture itself, probably most in the current regime, actually work just in representation terms. The workers' conditions are being getting worse and worse through the last decades. There is no political security. I mean, social security, sorry, neither political. But what I'm just trying to point out is probably in certain places, the mock institutionality is the actual institutionality of these museums and certain institutions. And I don't know if I know that you weren't trying to say the same thing, but how to use these concepts of decolonizing, where the museum is actually, I mean, where a sort of open politics is getting represented, and certain exploitations, abuses are getting inside the museum. I'm just talking about labor security. Probably not here, because this is part of the university, but another institutions are working there.
Are the people who work in museums in Mexico often unionized? Do they have unions? Or?
Part of the workers
Yeah,
are in
part of
unions
them,
and part not.
Yeah, but are the unions not very strong? Or are they not?
They are.
Yeah.
But
So how are
one
they?
thing is that, for example, curators and people from the education programs, they are not
Yes,
under those.
and I think that's exactly what Julio, they did in the new museum when they brought this organization in to stop the unionization. They took people who were like working at one level and they gave them a new title. So they then became, you know, they couldn't be unionized, right? They didn't necessarily give them improved pay. They just gave them a new title. So it's one of the tricks that they used to try to break up the union. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really tough question. It's a good question because everywhere, people who work in the culture industry, for the most part, are very precarious. Unless they happen to have family money or something like that, it's very difficult. Or unless you're like superstar, you're in a very precarious situation. So um, I would say the first. I mean, I don't work in a museum, but I would say the first step is to certainly acknowledge the problem and begin to have conversations about it and begin to sort of actually create a dialogue that could reach beyond just your museum, but to other institutions where similar situation is, so that you can sort of compare and contrast different situations and how they operate. I don't know whether the structure in the US is most museums, like all museums, are not for profit. Some are privately run, some have government structure, but even the government museums have very little funding from the government or the city. And you have a board, you know, a board of directors in many cases who control really the fiscal responsibility of the museum. And I would say that's the people that really need to be addressed with these kind of issues, because they're the ones ultimately who kind of control the direction of the museum, at least in the US context. I don't know how it works here. As you say, this is a different situation because it's a university. But even here, I'm sure that somewhere there's a group of directors who make decisions about what, you know, who gets paid what, how much time you get off, what kind of, you know, security you have if you get sick and for your children. And those are the fundamental issues that people need to really organize around, even if you're a curator, you know, not just a person who installs, let's say. What stops people from doing that? You know, I guess that's the question.
Pues tenemos una intervención más, por favor.
My question is related to a text you shared with us, the introduction to the Folk Journal. And in this text, in this article, there's a part you address pedagogy, and pedagogy as tools for social intervention. And today you also spoke about this shift in the museums, more oriented to social practice and programming, no? Not only centered in their exhibitions. And so my question is, what do you think is like the critical or the political agency of this pedagogic and social practice within the institutions? Because sometimes for me, it's more easy to see it outside, if you can speak of an outside, but for example, more as pedagogy as artistic media, for example. Yes, I'm thinking about this and I want to know your opinion. The critical and political agency of pedagogic practice within the museums.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. I think a lot of the social practice exhibitions that we see in museums, at least in the US context, are coming out of the education departments. That they're not often part of the main curatorial role of the museum, but they're part of the, you know, people who do the pedagogical work. So I think that already creates this link. So for example, someone like Pablo Hoguera, he works at the Museum of Modern Art in the education department. And of course, he's well known for his social practice art and his support of social practice art. So I think those things have a natural alliance. I can only speak in the context of like my own experience, really. So for a while, a very short while, I was curator of education at the New Museum in New York. And this was just as the founder, Marcia Tucker, was basically leaving the institution. Not necessarily on her own accord, let's put it that way. So it was an interesting moment where the museum was going from a model that was based on pedagogy and alternative practices, sometimes very interesting experiments in those things, to becoming more and more a kind of, I would say, mainstream, like a Kunsthalle, right? And more corporatized, more professionalized. For example, some of the projects that they did before I was there, let's say in the 1970s and 80s, they would do an exhibition of work and they would have wall labels that were blank. And they would give the audience as they came in a pencil and they would say, you write the wall label, you know. I mean, they did all kinds of interesting things to try to shake up the idea of the museum. This is New Museum, including allowing everybody on the staff to have a vote in what the next exhibition was. Everybody, including the janitor who does the cleaning of the museum. They would come to the meetings and discuss what was happening along with the curators. I arrived just at the moment all of that was being overturned. And they were getting rid of all of those kind of alternative ideas, you know, which do go back to the New Left or counterculture 60s, where, you know, both of those things. And what we saw coming in was much more sort of, you know, hierarchical model. In fact, Gerardo Mascara was, you know, one of the curators at the time, although there were all kinds of issues getting his visa worked out, so I didn't really see him. So I worked in the education department and tried to really make a lot of changes and do a lot of things rapidly. It was an interesting year of experience for me. I didn't really have a background in institutions. I made a number of stupid mistakes relating to how I dealt with the board of directors and other things. And ultimately, I was fired from the museum, basically, which was probably saved my life because I was like going crazy trying to make things happen. But it was a very interesting experience in learning how the hierarchy of the museum operates, what to do, what to not do. And I think, you know, the education department and the concept of education or pedagogy in the museum is the place where these kind of changes can really begin to take root. But you need, if you're going to work within the structure of the museum, you need to have cover from above, right? You have to have people at the level of the board or whoever is you're directing your museum be interested in what you're working on. You can't just create a rebellion and expect not to be expunged. So I would say if you want to create change from within, then you have to also learn carefully the landscape. You have to create a good map. Let's call it an ideological map of the institution you're in. Know who your allies are, know where the problems are, learn the ways to make change happen. But you also have to be firm and stay focused and stay targeted, because I think the institution is very good at sort of like wearing you down, you know, wearing you down. I find that within academia. It's another story. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but
Yes, thank you.
yeah.
Una última intervención. No se vayan a arrepentir luego en casa. Dijeron, tuve la oportunidad de preguntar y no lo hice. Por favor, acá al frente.
It's just, I'm a curator here at MOAC, and we have this situation where we try to work with these young artists that are working in these collectives, independent, so it's very strange because each time that we invite them, they accept and they present their show as a collective, but also personally. And then, of course, then they go outside and it's their job, and they say the institution is just like death of art, you know, or whatever we put in, it's been institutionalized and no. But then at some point when I could kind of reach one of them is when I told them, yeah, but you're 21 and you live with your friends and you don't have a kid and you don't have to pay for, insurance and So then even if museums workers have a precarious situation, being not having this kind of security, even if it's not good enough, it's better than having anything else. So then what happens when you have all these kind of, for example, when you're a mother, you know, and you need to provide for your kid, and then being within the institution sometimes is the best, just
reality, you know? So I don't know, I think sometimes these critiques don't take in account the whole complication of the situation. I mean, who has the luxury of being outside, you know, because it's kind of a luxury. You know, I was meaning to ask, how do you pay for these kind of actions? Or why, I mean, you work in a university, you have, I mean, how is your living, you know, how you solve these things, especially if you're not alone, you know?
No, that's always a good question. The group that I first started talking about, political art documentation distribution, back in the 80s, it was all volunteer. There was no money. It was, but then in the 1980s, you could live in New York City very cheaply. So we all had cheap apartments, you know, and expenses weren't as high. And there were some grants. We got a few grants. None of us got paid directly, but it helped support, let's say, a newspaper or whatever. But we'd put a lot of work of our own into it. And I worked, was my job. My first job was as a bicycle messenger, delivering things, but I didn't have a bicycle. Very bad, didn't work. Then I actually got a job making prototypes of children's toys in a factory, in a kind of small factory space where we made the version of them that would be scaled up for production later. And I did a lot of work like that for years. So all of that, and then I had my own business for a while, shop, where I produced prototypes and models of things for advertising before digitalization came in. My point being that all of that supported my ongoing work as an artist, because I also make art that hangs in galleries, which I don't usually show. And my activism, you know, was always supported by that situation. You can't do that today because it's just too precarious. I mean, you could, then New York was like, and a lot of cities were easier. Now, I don't think anybody could really do that easily. And as you say, you have a family, you know, I raised a kid too. It's very, very difficult. So me personally now, I'm a tenured full professor, which means it's very hard to fire me, you know, which means, you know, I have a lot more, I mean, I don't get a huge salary because I work for a public institution. You can actually look my name up and see my salary online because I work for the city and the state. And in New York today, you know, it's a good salary if I lived somewhere else, but not so much in New York City. But I do have a lot of protections and a lot of privileges. I'm white, you know, I'm a man. I've had all these privileges all this time. And there's no question that that has allowed me to take risks that other people really couldn't take, as your point. So this is not, I'm not presenting this to say this is what you should do or shame on you for not doing it by any means. And I teach students, and if they get a job in a museum, I'm like, great, you know, here's how you survive. You know, coming back to your point, you know, don't do this because I made that mistake, and try not to do that. And you know, but can you incrementally make changes if that's what you need to do? Of course, you know, you can't just say, to hell with you, I'm leaving. I'm going to sit outside the museum like Greta Thunberg every Friday and protest, you know. That would be beautiful, but it's not realistic for everybody. So, but you can create alliances with people on the outside who are doing work. But you just have to be very careful politically, and just, you know, obviously, because the powers that be, you know, they don't like that. So I don't know if that's an answer, but honestly, a lot of the people in Gulf labor are in similar situations. They're tenured professors, and they can take these risks. Not everyone, but some of them. Yeah.
¿Alguien pidió la palabra al final? Ah, vale. ¿Se arrepintieron o no llegó el micrófono? Ah, ya. Y generó mucha expectativa, ¿no?
I think you're the local translator back there, right? It's great. It's brilliant.
¿Alguna intervención más, no? Greg,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you very much. Muchas gracias al MUAC, a todo el equipo que ha hecho posible tanto la retransmisión como que estén ustedes hoy acá. Y los invitamos a seguir el resto de actividades de Abajo el Muro. Chequen las redes sociales, todo va a estar en streaming. Entonces nos pueden seguir ahí cuando estén las actividades en otras ciudades, y volveremos al MUAC en varios meses. El 10 de diciembre estaremos de vuelta cerrando Abajo el Muro en este mismo foro. Muchas gracias.